So now that we understand the key concepts pertaining to EC2 instances and we've toured the AWS marketplace, what's left to do but to go ahead and launch a few instances and get familiar with the process. So if you want to log into your account and follow along with me, go ahead and first ensure that your region selected is Northern Virginia, and then go ahead and navigate to the EC2 dashboard by searching for EC2 in your search bar. Once here, go ahead and click on Instances. And as you can see, we have no instances currently deployed. So go ahead and click on Launch Instance. The default selection is the Amazon Linux AMI, and by default, the free tier parameters are already selected for this configuration, but let's take a look at them anyway. We see here that there are multiple flavors of AMIs for Amazon Linux, but we'll stay with the default one selected, and let's name this instance Linux-server and scroll down to the instance sizes. As we learned earlier, it is the micro instances, and more specifically the T2 micro ones, that are eligible for free tier. We did not discuss the key pair, but to access a Linux instance via the SSH protocol, we're gonna need to create a key pair. But if you already had created one, you would be able to select it here from the drop-down menu. Amazon will store the public key, but we need to safely ensure that we store the private key so that no one else has access to the key, as this private key provides the authentication for logging in. So always store the private key somewhere safe. And again, let's create a key pair. I'll name this one Linux-key. And when I click create key pair, it'll automatically download the private key. So we're all set there. Now the security group is visible in both the VPC service and the EC2 service, but it's tied to resources such as an instance. So that's why we're going to discuss it here. A security group acts as a virtual firewall for your EC2 instances to control both incoming and outgoing traffic. Inbound rules control the incoming traffic to your instance, and outbound rules control the outgoing traffic from your instance. One thing to know about security groups is that if you permit traffic in a security direction, for example, we will make a rule in just a few moments that permits SSH inbound for just our public IP address. But we do not have to make a matching rule in the outbound direction, as the return traffic will automatically be allowed once we create an inbound rule. This is what is known as a stateful firewall. By default, every security group created allows all outbound traffic. So that's the reason why the inbound rule is the one displayed to configure by default. But we'll see this in just a few minutes. But for now, let's click Edit to modify the network settings. If you recall, we deleted the default VPC that came with the account at the end of our last module. So we should just have one VPC displayed here, but just in case you've created an extra VPC or two, let's select the NYF production VPC that we created, as the subnets in the route tables are already properly configured to allow connectivity. For the subnet, let's select the public 1A subnet. Next up, we will choose Enable for auto-assigning a public IP to this instance. Picking this selection will make this instance publicly accessible from the internet, but if we were to stop or reboot our server, every time we did so, we would get a different IP address for our instance. So in a production network, you don't typically want to pick this method, but for our purposes, it will work just fine. Now it's time to work on our security group. Let's start off by naming ours Linux-SG. And the SSH protocol is the one we will use to connect via command line to this instance. So we'll just leave the default. But because this will be exposed to anyone on the internet, let's change the source type to my IP. And now only our single host will be able to access this instance in the cloud. This is a great security practice to limit the exposure to just the ports that are needed and to just the IP addresses that are needed as well. Give it a description, and once you do, we're all good here in this section. The default storage is good for what we're doing here, but you can see that there are various types of storage which we will discuss in an upcoming module. But for now, go ahead and leave the default selection of GP2. Expanding advanced details, and we have tons of parameters that can be modified to your organization's particular needs. Explore these options and go ahead and learn about what capabilities are offered and just play around in this section a little bit. But we will leave these default settings here and move on to the user data section. This section is where we can enter text or a file to function as a script. It'll execute instructions for our instance, such as if we wanted to set a default username while the instance is launching so we don't have to do it later, or enable a service so that each time the system starts, we don't have to log into the CLI and do so. We can enter that type of instructions here. But we're all good with the free tier selections that we've made. So now let's just click on Launch Instance, and you'll see that our settings were appropriate because right here up top, we can see success. Had there been any issue, we would have seen an error message here. You can also set billing alerts here, but we're all good with the free tier selections that we made. So let's simply click on View All Instances. The instance state is currently pending, and shortly it will change to initializing. But while it's doing that and launching, we can already see tons of details about our instance, such as the private IP address from the subnet that we selected, along with the public IP that we're going to need to access this instance. We can validate that our inbound security group rule is allowing SSH for just our public IP, and likewise, the outbound rule is permitting all outbound traffic. But again, lots of useful information displayed for this instance. Clicking on the status tab, we see the 2 checks that are performed for each instance that's spun up. And if there's any issues with launching an instance, these won't display a green check mark once the checks are done. But let's wait for those checks to be completed. All right, now that the checks are all good, we see that both have passed along with the status check showing 2 of 2 checks passed here. And on the monitoring tab, AWS tracks and displays various metrics about the instance, such as the CPU utilization and packets processed by the instance. You can change the range to show data from the last hour on to the last 2 weeks. And by enabling detailed monitoring, the metrics are displayed in increments of 1 minute instead of the default of 5-minute intervals. But this will cost you, so we will not enable that setting. One last thing to share before we log into our instance is that you have the ability to show or hide fields that are pertinent to how you wish for the information to be displayed. So clicking on the gear icon here, we can check the fields for, say, VPC ID, subnet ID, and private IP address. And when we click close, we now see that this information is displayed for us. So now it's time to connect to our device. But before doing so, we need a utility that can allow us to do that. So I suggest a utility tool called MobaXterm, and the link will be in the description. There's a free version that's portable, so simply download it for your operating system and then run the executable. So now let's copy the public IP address for our instance. And after launching MobaXterm, paste that address into the remote host field. Next, click on the Advanced SSH Settings tab and place a check in the box beside Use Private Key, and click here to search for that private key that you downloaded earlier. Once you have it, simply double click on it. Finally, click OK, and this should start your SSH session. You should be prompted for the username if everything was done correctly. The default username for this particular instance, the Amazon Linux, is going to be EC2-user, all lowercase. And the private key will provide the authentication. And so now once you hit enter, we're logged into our AWS Linux instance. And because our security group allows all outbound traffic, we can see that pings to Google servers are resolving correctly. And a quick curl on a website such as ESPN.com will provide the contents of the web page so we know that we have outbound connectivity from our server. And of course, inbound connectivity because we were able to successfully SSH into our instance. That's all there is to launching your very first EC2 instance, so great job there. I'll see you in the next video where we will launch a Windows server.